And you'll be very glad as well that you didn't have to listen to more of me just speaking that and then speaking again afterwards. So I've actually just got back from Egypt. I was there this past week for work to visit a lab, one of our labs around the world, and audit the lab. And as I was there, and I was then finalising my thoughts on this, and I was thinking, I suddenly realised that I was in Egypt. And then I was thinking, well, that's a bit far to go just to do a bit of research for a sermon on Sunday night. But it was very interesting, actually, because I've been once before, never saw anything of Egypt, because you go away on these things and you go to work and then you go back to hotel and then you go back to work, and you don't see anything usually of the countries you go and visit. But this time, the guy I was visiting had booked the 2 hours at the very end to go and see the National Mummy Museum. So I went in and I saw, they've got 2 floors, one which is down and underground a little, and it's almost set up a bit like, I don't know if you've seen any of the National Geographic things of going into the tombs. It's set up a bit like that, so you're going down into a tomb, and it's darkened, and then they've got these glass cases of basically, not all of the Egyptian kings, but the mummies of many of them. So the Amenhotep, and Thutmose the first and the second, Seti the first, Ramesses the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and the ninth. They were missing 6 to 8 for some reason, but it was very interesting and really had me thinking about, I was there in the place that they had escaped from a culture that was oppressing them, and escaping out to be God's people in their own culture, and God was taking them out of Egypt to purify them so that they wouldn't be contaminated by other cultures. So that's basically what was going on over the 400 years they'd been enslaved in Egypt. They'd begun to take on some of the practices of the Egyptians. They got contaminated by the culture that's there at the moment, and we can so easily also be pulled into that culture. So tonight we're going to look at. I've put it into three sections: idiotic, idolatrous Israelites, because I like a little bit of alliteration, and to look at idolatry. Because that's basically what they had fallen into there. They had made a golden calf, which was one of the idols of Egypt. So they'd basically been taken out of Egypt to get rid of that culture, and immediately seemed to be falling back into that culture that they've grown up in for hundreds of years. Idiotic, idolatrous Israelites, then relationship, not service, and then finally covenant, not contract. So I don't know if as I was reading this, I had to read back into Exodus, because you need to understand the context as it's come in. I needed to understand. I've read it several times before, but I needed to remind myself of everything that's gone before, and what you see. I know you've been going through this series. I don't know which particular parts you've looked at in depth. But basically, from chapter 13 onwards, God takes the Israelites out of Egypt. He miraculously parts the Red Sea so that they can get out, and then he leads them through the desert as a pillar of fire during the day. Through the night, and a pillar of cloud during the day, and the Israelites would have associated cloud with the presence of God. because God was leading them as a pillar of cloud during the day. And then you come to chapters 19 and 20, where God gives Moses the Ten Commandments, and God comes down onto Mount Sinai as a cloud. It also then goes on to say as smoke and fire, and there's thunder and lightning, and that the sounds of trumpets as well. And so all this sound was God speaking to Moses. And so the presence of God is coming down onto Mount Sinai. Moses is going into the presence of God, and he goes out of sight of the Israelites, but the cloud's there. So God is there. And then you've also got later on, there's the tent of meeting. Moses, so in this passage in chapter 33, Joel just read that Moses took himself out to the tent of meeting, and the pillar of cloud would come and sit at the entrance of the tent of meeting, God's presence with it. So this association of the cloud with God's presence would have been very strong in the Israelites' minds. And yet, Moses has gone away for 40 days. And they begin to forget. How with that cloud there, and I don't know if it continued to thunder and lightning, but in my mind I'm thinking, how on earth do these people suddenly forget what this cloud signifies? And then go and start asking, well, go to Aaron, let's make some gods so that we can worship those gods that brought us out of Egypt. And they seem to have taken these things for granted. This cloud presence that has been with them throughout, the signature of God's presence with them, they've taken that as granted. They've begun to forget that it's signifying the God who brought them out of Egypt. And all of those miracles that had passed, the plagues, this being saved from the Passover, all of those things they've taken for granted. And it's so easy for us to think, what idiots. How could you forget that? How could you not see that? But we take things for granted. We get used to the situations that we're in. I don't know how many of you during COVID, as things began to open up again, were a bit hesitant about meeting other people, because we got so used to being isolated from people. Unless you're one of those people whose job or your circumstances meant you were still meeting people. But so many people have got very hesitant. I see that in my work. Still some people will keep away from everyone, because we get used to the conditions that we're in. We take them for granted. I lived in Norway for 11 years, and when I first moved to Norway, I remember being there, and there was some questions about pay, and over here in workplaces, if you get asked to do something, some additional responsibility, you do it because it gets you on in your career. And you just go and do it. In Norway, the first thing they ask is how much additional pay is that? And then it got to some new things in the lab that we would need, some new positions that were needed, and the immediate question is how much are we going to get paid for them? Well, they're doing it already. It's just it was going to be formalised into a position of slightly more responsibility, and I'm going, why are you not? But they're not satisfied with the pay they have because they've got used to that, and they're wanting more, and we're all like that. We take for granted the things that are just evident around us and are continual around us, and we have to be continually aware of the potential that we are the same. To try not to take things for granted. There's the adage of count your blessings every day. And it's not to it's basically as a reminder that God has done all these things. What has God done? It may not be we may not think it's as miraculous as the Passover, of being provided manna in the desert, of being provided with water in the desert, all of these miraculous things. But what's miraculous in the first place is life, is the continuation of us breathing, that we don't get hit by a car and die. All these things, the daily life that we have, the food on the table, all of those things are provided by God. And how quickly they forget, how quickly we forget. And we need to be vigilant in our own lives that we are not forgetting. Because the other thing is that they've then created an idol. It said in chapter 20, God says, there's a line saying, "Do not make idols of silver nor idols of gold." And this is the first thing they're doing. Once Moses is out of the way, this is what they're doing. Direct disobedience to something God has specifically said they're not to do. And we see it talks about God's anger of the disobedience. And we sometimes don't get that. We sometimes we forget about the fear of the Lord. That when we come here, when we come in God's presence, we are coming before a holy God. And we are not holy. We're coming before a God who is pure. And we are not pure. And purity and impurity can't mix. And so it's important to hold ourselves pure. And we sometimes forget about that. I've been challenged by this as I've been doing it. I'm 35 years a Christian. I became a Christian not in this building, in this church, the people of this church, as a student here. So that's now 35 years I've been a Christian. And it's a struggle. You do have to remind yourself. You have to be able to count your blessings. There are specific times in my life where I know God's action and work in my life. And when things are tough and I'm beginning to doubt, I go back to those times where I remember God spoke to me, or God showed me something. God acted in a way that it can't have been just coincidence. And I remind myself, this is real. And remind myself to keep pushing on. That my fight is against my own thoughts, my own self, my own flesh. That's my main fight, is the fight against myself and my propensity to fall into sin. To fall into idolatry. Because when God tells Moses, these people, he says, Moses sought the favour of the Lord and says, "Lord, why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand?" And what we then see is when Moses actually comes, so he stays God's anger a little from that, but when Moses comes down down the hill and sees what's actually happened, he throws the tablets, breaks the law. Not literally. Well, yes, literally. But yeah, you know what I mean. But that's symbolic, basically, of the law being broken by the people as well. It's also in some ways symbolic that the law cannot save us. We cannot be saved by following the rules, because we cannot follow the rules. Not perfectly. And Moses calls it a great sin. He says to Aaron, the leader, or his second, such a great sin. So there's actually more responsibility on leaders to not be leading other people astray than there are on the general people. Because it's very important that we're attempting at least to following God's rules. We are made to glorify God. I'll come back to that in a bit. But this is very clear. The people creating idols and worshipping idols. But actually, the heart of every sin is idolatry. Now, that idol might be self and self-confidence, or thinking that you can do things yourself, that we can do God's work ourselves. It might be money, but money is then an idol. If our main focus is on money, the money is really an idol. It's taking up precedence instead of God. These things today, that's probably the thing I need to be most careful of these days, is that this doesn't become an idol. That most of my time isn't taken up on. I've got my Bible up on here, so I could be reading the Bible, but it's so easy to get pulled in when this comes and gives you notifications, and you start being pulled away, or you're in the middle of church and a notification comes and your mind takes away and it becomes on this. This can be an idol. We need to be very careful of this. And idolatry is the fundamental basis of all sin. Basically not going along with God's plan for your day or for your year or for your life. And so it's important for us to keep in line with what God's plan is for us. And it's such a great sin. That's what we're told. So what are we to do? Well, we're given in these passages an indication, one of what not to do and one of what to do. And that's the relationship, not service. So first, because the next part of the chapter 32 is initially talking about Aaron. Or Aaron, I don't know how you pronounce it. But he's talking about Moses' brother, who is not, he's Moses' second in command, or is Moses' mouthpiece. Because earlier on, I don't know if you looked at this, Moses didn't want to speak. He was afraid to speak. And so God said, well, I'll choose Aaron, he can speak well. And so Aaron speaks, but Moses has the relationship with God. So Aaron speaks the words that have been given from God to Moses to Aaron to speak out to the people. But Aaron doesn't have the relationship immediately. And so then the people are coming to him and saying, no, where's Moses? Where's this man who brought us out of Egypt? And that keeps going on. That's a theme through these passages, or through the 19 from Exodus 19 and 20 as well, or earlier, where God says, I am the Lord, or I am your God, who brought you out of Egypt, or shall bring you out of Egypt. And that sort of phrase keeps getting used and switched. So in here, the people are saying to Aaron, that man who brought us out of Egypt. So they've got rid of God in that equation. They've forgotten about that. And they want to make some gods. Because we can't worship a man who brought us out of Egypt. We've got to worship some God who brought us out of Egypt. So make us one. And Aaron just caves. He goes and makes the gold, and gets them to give them their gold, and goes and makes this golden calf. But obviously he knows it's wrong, because in the next verses it talks about how he then tries to make a service to the Lord, or a worship session to the Lord. to try and bring it back to God. So he obviously knows that making the golden calf is wrong. But we can think it's so, he's not strong enough. But we can be the same. In cultural pressure, in peer pressure, do we stand strong in our beliefs? Do we stand strong enough in what we believe and in what is right and what we know to be the truth in our hearts? Or are we like Aaron and cave quickly to peer pressure? And as I go through this, what I see is that Aaron didn't have the relationship with God. Not quite to the same extent. He may have had obviously he's wanting to serve God, and he's serving God in speaking, in being Moses' second in command of trying to lead these people. But he caves to peer pressure because he doesn't have the same extent to what Moses has. And Moses, who has the relationship with God, direct relationship with God, when he comes down and sees what's happened, he's very strong. He would not have let that happen if he was in Aaron's place. And we see, in contrast, Moses taking time away. The tent of meeting in chapter 33, it says about him having a practice of taking the tent out from the people, away out of the camp, and meeting with God out of there. And as I was reading that, it just reminded me of the times we're told through the Gospels of Jesus taking time away from separately from the disciples, of being alone and taking time with God, of having that relationship. And here we've got Moses having a relationship. It talks about Moses speaking face to face with God. Now, I'm not quite sure if that was a literal face to face, because then it talks about how you can't see his face because it would be too glorious, and in the presence of God we would die because of that impurity, not being able to mix. It's too radiant. So I'm not quite sure whether it was a literal face-to-face. We read in other places that angels come, that you can entertain angels unaware. So angels can take on a form that potentially looks human and you don't realise it's an angel. But we read other places like Gabriel and the angels in the Bethlehem story. We see them taking on a form that is shining and glorious. And so is God in the tent of meeting taking on a form that is visible and okay to see with God? I've never experienced that.
It's an interesting thing, and a lot of sort of, what's the word for like a faith where it's like one God? I forget the word for it, but it's like in some faiths, and including that, the descriptions of angels, even of God, sometimes you can't imagine what they look like.
No.
The descriptions of some angels sound.
Oh yeah, in Ezekiel and Daniel, it's very, very alien. And so, but what we're seeing here is he's speaking face to face. Now that could be literally face to face, or it could be a metaphor. But it's a taking time on a personal level and speaking with God, and God speaking back. Now, I don't know if you've ever had the experience of hearing a voice. It's happened to me once, of hearing an actual voice in a room speaking to me, telling me to go and speak to someone, and then going and speaking to them, and they were having difficulties, and it resolved an issue. That, I believe, was God speaking to me directly. I never saw anything. It was just like someone was standing just there and said something. I looked around and there was no one there. If that's not happened, it doesn't matter. But that sometimes we often, as you're thinking, you know deep down, you have a sense of what God is saying. You feel it, and as you go on in a walk and get to know when you interpret things wrong. So in John 15, it talks about my sheep know my voice. That could be just a deep sense of understanding God's will, of a deep peace that you're currently in God's will, and that something that's said or something that you believe you're to do is correct, and that's, I don't know if that's what it's meaning here, but Moses had a relationship with God. The relationship is more important than the service. So Aaron had a more serving role. And sometimes serving can become an idol. So that we get so tied up in doing things for God that we forget who the person is and don't take time with the person of God. And what we learn from Moses is the utter reliance on God. In Exodus 33, 15, 16, it says, "Then Moses said, 'If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all other people on the face of the earth?'" So what distinguishes me from the people in my workplace? What distinguishes you from the people in your peer group? Is it an utter reliance on God? Because we are called to be counter-cultural. If the culture is not in God's will. Hopefully in a Christian culture, the Christian culture is within God's will. But in our society today, we're not in a society that is within God's will. And we're called to be countercultural. In chapter 34 here, in verse 13, it talks about breaking down the altars and smashing the sacred stones. So breaking down the idols. What is our current cultural idol? I think Graham touched a little on one this morning at least, and it's the being tolerant of one another, except as long as that is the general public view of what tolerance is. And if you don't hold that view, then you're subjected to a lot of severe intolerance. And in Romans 12, in chapter 2, it says, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And that's what we're called. We're called to review our own lives, review our own souls. Psalm 139 is my favourite psalm. "Search me, O God, and know me. See if there's any..." I've forgotten the phrase now, but see if there's any basically untrue way within me. Basically, search me and see whether I'm pure. Help me to be pure. And that's what our lives should be doing. That's what we should be doing each day. And when we do that, we begin to be made more into the likeness of the one that we're coming before, the one that we have the relationship. We may not have a face that is radiant and shining like Moses, that people are then afraid of, but our actions and our words would be more in line with what God would want to say through us. 2 Corinthians 3 and verses 12 says this, "Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who would put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing the end of what was passing away. But their minds were made dull, for to this day the same veil remains when the old covenant is read. It has not been removed because only in Christ is it taken away." Even to this day, when Moses is read, a veil covers their hearts. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So we are to spend time with the Lord and seeking to be pure in his ways, so that we are transformed, that we are being made, we are being sanctified, we are being made right. Well, we are made right in Christ, but we are being made pure. So that in Christ, on Judgment Day, once we've died, or if Jesus comes again, that we can stand pure and clean. That's what Christ does for us. And this comes back to the third point, or comes on to the third point, which is covenant, not contract. Because it's not dependent on me or on you. This is dependent on God. And the difference between why I say covenant and contract, and it talked about covenant all through here, because there is a difference between a covenant and a contract. A contract is like going to a shop. We all do this every day when we go in and buy something. You have some money, they have something you want to buy, and you exchange the thing you want to buy for money. That's a contract. A contract is when you get something in return for giving something else. But God's covenant is a covenant. And a covenant is a promise. A promise to do something without any return. So God promises the Israelites he will show amazing things. He promises Abraham, I will make you a great nation, and all nations will be blessed through you. He promises to us through Christ that we will one day stand in glory. It's not dependent on us. We can do nothing in that. It's all dependent on God, on God's covenant and God's promise to us. Marriage is actually meant to be a sign or a picture of a covenant. And our culture today has got marriage a little wrong. It sees marriage as a contract at the moment. So you say, I do. The promises you made are for better or for worse, in sickness and health, till death us do part. That is the promise. Today it's more like until we've fallen out of love with one another, or our sex life is not as sufficient for me anymore, or until you're no longer as beautiful as you used to be. That's contract. That's saying, I will be with you until you don't give me what I want. Whereas marriage is, I promise to be with you, to be faithful to you throughout. And it's hard. There are times when you disagree, and you disagree sometimes strongly, and it is a tough thing. But it's meant to be that picture of a covenant, that you promise to do something and you keep your promise. Unfortunately, we are sometimes unable to keep our promises. I'm not just talking marriage, but I promise to be faithful to God throughout my life. So many of the people I was as a Christian, the guy who actually first invited me along to church has fallen away. I pray for him that God will draw him back. Other people I knew as a student have fallen away over time because of life's tests and because life can be tough. God doesn't promise that it will be all easy sailing. He promises that he will be with us. Sometimes our own mind tries to tell us he's not with us, even though he's always with us, because he's promised that, and we can trust him. So God's covenant, he shows the force and the measure of his covenant when he sent his son to die for us. That Jesus' death was a seal and a guarantee of his covenant. All we need to do is accept. Back to Corinthians, that verse. Therefore, since we have such a hope, we are very bold. We are not like Moses, who put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from seeing. But whenever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Now the Lord is the Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. So my life and my spiritual life, my spiritual future is not dependent on my faithfulness. It's dependent on God's faithfulness. And I can guarantee his faithfulness. I can't guarantee my own. My part is to try not to put other idols before my God, which is difficult because we find that it's so easy to just slip into doing things where that thing is taking up more of your time than God, or more of your time than it should. And we need to continually monitor our lives. Paul talks about it in Romans 7, about the flesh and the spirit, and the war between flesh and spirit. I encourage you to read Romans 7. So beware of idolatry. What is your current idol? And your current idol may not be the same as your idol was a year ago, because God may have spoken to you about that idol, and you got through that, and he's worked on that, and you're a bit purer. Now he's pointing out a different idol, and then in a few months' time or a year's time, he'll point out a different idol, and then you might find you've gone back to this idol. And you need to work on that. And God, in my life, God keeps pointing out, you need to work on this. You need to work on this. You need to work on this. At the moment, as a scientist and somebody who is task-orientated, I'm not very people-orientated, or less people-orientated. And that's what God's been speaking to me about again, is looking out, being more loving, being more caring, looking out for people, and then I'll probably go back to some previous thing that I've been. So over time, you go through these cycles of working on things, hopefully getting slightly better and better each time. So beware of idols. Be aware that it's a relationship, not service. Spending time with God is important. And at the end of the day, we come to him because he has taken the sins. It's his covenant to us, not dependent, thankfully, not dependent on ourselves. And we can trust in him.